This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Welcome to Uncorking a Story, the podcast that introduces you to the rich world of storytellers who share their personal journeys, creative processes, and the stories behind their stories, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and I'm thrilled to be part of your writing journey. If you're an aspiring writer, a literary enthusiast, or simply someone who believes in the transformative power of words, you've come to the right place. Every week, we'll pop the cork on the world of successful storytellers and give you a healthy pour of inspiration, insight, and empowerment. My mission is to help writers like you realize your full potential through the transformative and therapeutic power of writing. Whether you're just starting your literary voyage or looking to refine your craft, I'm here to provide you with the knowledge, inspiration, and encouragement you need to embark on your own storytelling adventure. So, are you ready to uncork your story and let your creativity flow? Uncorking a Story is about to begin. Sit back, relax, and let the transformative magic of storytelling whisk you away. Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Well, hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Uncorking a Story. I'm Mike Carlin, and I'm so excited to have you with me as I uncork another story. I want to remind you to please follow our show on all social media platforms, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Hell, I'll even throw in TikTok. We're trying to do TikTok. I'm not dancing, but we are putting videos up there and they are getting some reach. You can find us on all of those platforms at Uncorking a Story. Just a quick note on YouTube, it's been a great platform for growth of the show. You know, I just read something recently where YouTube has become the #1 platform for podcasting in the United States. And we've certainly seen some growth there. And I thank you all who are going to YouTube to watch our show. But in addition to being another, vehicle for distribution, it's been a great way for me to interact with the audience and for fans of the show to interact with each other. So I encourage you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel by going to YouTube, searching for Uncorking a Story, and hitting subscribe. For you audio listeners out there, please subscribe, rate, and review Uncorking a Story wherever you get your podcast. Doing so is a great way for us to extend the reach of our show and expose it to more and more listeners. So thank you for doing that in advance. Now, today on the show, we have a fascinating author named Florence Reiss Kraut, and I can't wait for you to hear her story. One element, though, really stood out to me. Florence wanted to be a writer from a very young age. She knew as a kid sitting around, her family room table with all of her aunts, uncles, cousins, they were all natural storytellers. They were all immigrants and natural storytellers. And that's what she wanted to do from a young age. But she found that once she started her career, now she had a long career as a social worker, as a clinician, she had very little time to write, to devote to her craft. She also had 3 small children at home, which doesn't make it easier to have free time. And she did not find success immediately. She actually did wind up, starting to write again during her career because, that's an itch that doesn't necessarily go away no matter how often you scratch it. But she was hammering away on a manuscript. She almost gave up on her dream of becoming an author, but she didn't. She decided to take some classes. She worked with developmental editors, and she continued to hammer away at her first book for almost 10 years before it got published. Now, that's a long time, 10 years to write a book. Now, in contrast, her second book took about 1.5 years to write. There is a learning curve in this thing we call writing, and you do get better at it the more of it you do. But the point is, there is no such thing as an overnight success. And I talked to a lot of authors. I think we're up to 320 on the show right now. They all share something in common. It doesn't happen overnight for anybody. It takes a long time. The path to publishing is not straight. It is not narrow, and it certainly is not smooth. It is windy. It is rocky. But you've got to stay on the road. Stay on the road. My cousin Mick gave me that advice. Mick Carlin. Great author, look him up. Lives in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Has a lot of great books about jazz musicians, fictional books about jazz musicians. Stay on the road was his advice to me. So I'm going to give that to you. Stay on the road. You're going to find unexpected twists and turns on your journey. You're also going to find people who are willing to help you if you search for them. This is a very generous community we're a part of, the writing community. If you ask for help, somebody will give it to you. And if I can be one of those people for him, you just let me know. Reach out to me. I'm very easy to find. Go to uncorkingastory.com. My contact information's right there. One of my goals with the show is to help make you a better writer. So my lesson for today is to remind you to be persistent in your writing. Don't give up, even when you feel down, especially when you feel down. When you're running that marathon and it's like mile 22 and you only have a couple more to go, you don't stop. You have to push through the exhaustion. You will be proud that you finished. So finish your writing journey and ask for help when you need it. The dream can be yours, so please pursue it. Enough from me. I'm going to get off my soapbox. And now I'm going to introduce you to Florence Reiss Kraut. Florence Reiss Kraut is a native New Yorker, raised and educated in New York City. She holds a BA in English and a master's in social work and worked for 30 years as a clinician, a family therapist, and CEO of a family service agency while writing stories and essays for publication. Florence has published personal essays for the New York Times, and her fiction has appeared in journals such as the Evening Street Press, SNReview, the Westchester Review, and others. She joins me today on Uncorking a Story to talk about her career and latest novel, Street Corner Dreams. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Florence.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you here, Florence, and I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
Well, curiously enough, it begins when I was a very little girl and I was very interested in stories because in my family, which was a huge family I had 26 aunts and uncles and 31 first cousins, and I used to sit and listen to all of the stories that my aunts and uncles and parents told each other with lots of secrets and all kinds of interesting tidbits, some of which I probably didn't understand. And I always said I was going to be a writer. And so I made up stories all my childhood. And I scribbled them and wrote them and so on and so forth. And so I like to think that I began that way. But of course, that was just the backstory.
Well, so I love the fact that you came from a family of like natural storytellers, and that is sort of something that I've heard often. I'm curious, do you remember any of the stories that were being told from your childhood? Can you
Lots.
recall anything?
Oh my goodness, yes. I remember the stories because, my mother was one of 11 children. And she, they would talk about things that had happened to them as children. One of my uncles had run away when he was 12 years old and then came back and ran away again when he was 18 and joined the army. And so there were all kinds of stories about him. And he sort of disappeared, and then one of his sisters found him. So I always found that was very, very interesting and brought him back to the fold, so to speak. I remember the stories about the early dating years. And of course, my father's family and my mother's family became one family because my father and his youngest brother married my mother and her youngest sister. So that was, a tie-in. And my father's best friend was my mother's younger brother. So as you can see, there was a lot of incestuous kinds of relationships. And so there were lots and lots of stories. And the best friends of my aunts and uncles were also part of our family. We were very welcoming, open family, and I knew them. I knew them when I was growing up, so I just knew all these stories.
Did those stories ever serve as fodder for what you would sort of later write in fiction? Did you ever kind of lean into those or take inspiration from those?
Well, I can't say no. I mean, I think all writers write from their history. I don't, it's true that in fiction, one imagines and does a lot of what ifs, and I did that. But of course, some of these stories were sort of rooted in my background. The family was an immigrant family, lived in Brooklyn, New York, an immigrant Jewish family. And so I have in my roots that background. And some of the things, when you have such a large family, some of the things that happened become sort of the nugget of a story. And that's as much as I would say I took from my family. because
Yeah.
I know that my first book, which was is a family saga, which runs over 100 years with lots and lots of characters. And in the front of the book, there's a family tree because nobody can follow it without. Um, that book is probably it takes its flavor from my family. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
My second book, not that much, but there is one story that was sort of a nugget for that one. So, yes and no is the answer.
Well, I definitely want to dig into your time in Brooklyn, but I think I'm going to hold off on that until we start talking about Street Corner Dreams. Because, but
Okay.
before I do, I want to just dig into, you mentioned wanting to be a writer from the time you were very young. And then I
Right.
know in the background I read, you do have that BA in English, but there's also that master's in social work and that long
Right.
career as a clinician. Tell me a little bit about your decision to pursue social work and becoming a therapist.
Okay, that's a great question because it was sort of a turning point. I had spent my early years as a young adult writing, and I wrote a couple of novels. Got those were the days when you could send them in a slush pile and get them picked up. That's ancient history, and I did. I mean, I had a editor that was sort of interested in one of my. It was a young adult a novel, and she worked with me a little while, but we never did get it going to where she wanted it to be. At the time, I had three young children, and it was also the time, you won't remember this, but historically you will, that women were looking to move into the world. Somehow the constraints of being a wife and a mother for a lot of us was not enough. All of my friends were going out and getting jobs. I was the kind of person that everybody would come and tell stories to. They would talk to me. And I thought, social work would be a good outlet. And I wanted a career. I wanted to be able to earn some money. So I decided to go to social work school. And it was a brilliant decision, I must say. Um, what do people do when they come to a social worker? They tell you their story. So here I was, this latent storyteller, very interested in families and what went on in families. And my professional career was now blossoming with all kinds of stories, interesting stories, sad stories, happy stories. And I loved my social work career. I worked as a family therapist and a therapist, and then indeed I ran the agency. It was in Norwalk, Connecticut.
Oh,
So
sure.
that was almost 30 years of my adult life.
Yeah, and
And
that's
when I
not.
retired, oh, by the way, I should say I continued writing all that time. I was writing, I was taking classes, I went to Sarah Lawrence, I took workshops, I was in writing groups. So I never gave up writing. And when I finally retired and began writing, I had loads of stories, and that's what framed my first book. And then my second book, which was one was written in 9 years, and the second book was written in a year and a half.
Yeah, I definitely want to dig into that. But I'm curious, like in your career as a therapist, did you ever use writing or journaling as a therapeutic tool for your clients?
Um, Certainly, there were some clients for whom that was a very good tool to help them to organize what they really say what they were feeling without having the fear of being heard. And then once it was down on paper, they were able to share it. But I didn't use it as a tool all of the time.
Okay.
For the most part, it was a talk, a lot of family groups, a lot of couples. I did.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that first book because I'm curious. You said 9+ years to write it.
Right, right.
I certainly want to dig into what you learned between books to cut that down to a much
A year
shorter
and a
period
half.
of time. But tell me, like, what was the journey for that first book?
So I told you I had been spending years writing short stories, and I had all of these characters that were very real and truthful and honest in my heart. A lot of the stories had been published, and I started thinking that some of them made the nut of a family. So I decided I wanted to write a novel, but I couldn't lose these characters. So I began to put them together into this family saga, which I always loved family sagas. And I wrote about them. Um, I took 5 of them and made them uh, the the center of this family, and they appeared in each other's stories, and we followed them over the years. But it was a very complicated way to write a novel. I do not recommend it. I had a teacher who said to me, this is not an easy way to write a novel. But I got a developmental editor and she helped me. And then I was in these workshops, and people were very excited by the characters and the stories. And so I went on with it and I rewrote it. And then I brought it back and I rewrote it again. So the 9 years comprised writing the story about 4 or 5 times,
Yeah.
because it didn't have people would say, who's the protagonist? And I would say the protagonist is the family. It's not any one of the individual characters.
Yeah.
So that's why it took me so long.
Sure. Sure.
And it was published, by the way, in 2020, just when the pandemic hit.
Well, I mean, in some ways, it's good timing because people had a lot more free time, and I
Right?
know reading and writing were some. I'm talking to authors continuously who started their books that are coming out now. Either right before the pandemic or right in the middle of the pandemic. So I know it was a very productive time for many people, but
That's absolutely true. And
yeah,
one of the good things that happened to me was that this is a book that was a fabulous book for book clubs. And I was able to connect with book clubs all over the country and even in Canada and Mexico, because we had Zoom and
sure,
everybody was looking for something to do at home, and Zooming was fabulous. And so I did over 100 book clubs all over the country. And that's one of the ways that people got to read the book. So it was a happy circumstance for me, but a very unhappy one for the world.
yeah, of
So
course, of course. But we have to look for those silver linings, and I think that's
yes, exactly.
definitely the creativity that came forth is certainly a silver lining, and of course the way you can now promote books, appear at book clubs, appear at virtual
Right.
events by bookstores without having to leave your home. I mean, look, I still love to get on the road and travel, but you have to. There's an easy burnout factor there too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I can see that beginning to happen now that people are meeting personally. And fortunately I live in a very big area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Long Island. I could meet with book clubs in person. But I couldn't go to California easily. I mean, it's, this is the expense and the time. And so it's going to be different with this new book.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue to talk about the new book. So, what can you share with us about Street Corner Dreams?
Okay, so this book came about because my daughter is very interested in ancestry and family stories. She's also a family story person. And she had done some research on our extended family, not my mother's immediate small family of 11 brothers and sisters, but her cousins and so on. And she discovered that my mother had a first cousin who was a member of the gangs of actually Murder Incorporated, which at the time was very active in Brooklyn and East New York. And it had arisen through Prohibition when, the alcohol was illegal, but everybody wanted to drink. And so those people who were not afraid to break the law broke the law and made fortunes of money. And that's how organized crime really grew in New York. There were always the thugs. There were always the people in the tenements and so on who made money by bullying, but this was different because it was really organized. And she said, your mom had a first cousin who was a member of the gangs and was up in the Catskills and got murdered and in a gang war. And then he was buried in a pauper's grave. And she said, it turned out she had a couple of newspaper articles, and one of them said his mother disowned him, and the other one said his father went up and got the body and brought him back and reburied him in New York and went through the ritual Shiva for mourning for his son. And she said, could you imagine what went on in that family when that happened? And so that was the ultimate what if. I did not write that particular story, but I started thinking about what happened to those families that came to New York right before World War One, and they were very poor. What were the ways that they could get out of the tenements? I did a lot of research, and I discovered that there were two ways. You could work very hard, and it might take you 2 or 3 generations to build up something, or you could join these gangs and make a lot of money very quickly. And so I wove that into the novel, which is about a girl who comes with her sister, and this is not a giveaway because it's in the first 4 pages of the novel. She's 18 years old, and she accompanies her pregnant married sister on the boat to meet her husband who had preceded her to New York. And unfortunately, she dies in childbirth. So the sister gets off the boat with the baby to meet this husband who is, of course, very shocked and sad. So that's the start of the book.
Yeah.
And then what happened to this family as they go through World War One, as they go through the great Spanish flu epidemic, which was very interesting to me, having just gone through the pandemic.
Right.
And the years of the Depression, the Great Depression, and that's all woven into the story with the gangs and some romances. And that's the story. A little suspense here and there, people not sure what's going to happen.
I think it's an amazing time to write about, and I always wish if I had a time machine, I'd love to go back to New York in that sort of time frame. Now, probably wouldn't have liked the fact that there wasn't air conditioning. Probably a lot more walking, right? I mean, there's probably
sure,
a lot of stairs. Probably
people
a lot of
didn't
stairs
have
involved.
Stairs, no, yes, most of the buildings didn't have elevators, even though elevators existed, of course. Absolutely true. And the streets were where a lot of the things took place, especially for young people, because they didn't have playrooms. They didn't have, everybody lived in very crowded circumstances if they were poor, and most immigrants were very poor. So they lived on the streets, and all kinds of things happened on the streets, as we know. If you've watched The Godfather, if you watched Goodfellas, or you've seen these things.
Sure.
And that was the way that it was.
So my grandmother was an Italian immigrant, and splitting time between, I think, Newark. The first time they came over, they were in Newark, because
Hmm.
my great grandfather had a shop, and then these people you mentioned, the gangs, would come
Yes,
and they'd make him pay sort of
right.
protection money, and then he
Absolutely.
said, I left Italy to come away from this, so he wound
Hmm.
up moving back to Italy, and my grandmother's
Wow.
brothers and sisters were all born over there, and then when she came back, it was to Brooklyn, but she would tell me stories about immigrants, and 'cause they didn't speak English, so
Right.
they would mime what they needed in the grocery store. And some of
Right.
the biggest laughs I remember from my childhood was my grandmother showing me how they would like cluck like a chicken to say I need eggs. um or one said to describe she needed a colander, and she goes, uh water and macaroni go in, macaroni stay, water go bye bye. She would in broken English. She would say it,
She could have been an actor, right? A mime.
but yeah,
Absolutely.
but an amazing time period though.
It really, and that what you were describing about the protection money went on all the time, and it was not, of course, just the Italian
Sure.
mobs. There were Jewish mobs, and there were Irish mobs, and Polish. On every street corner, there was another group of mobsters that were running the area. So,
Well, yeah, and I
and
think in any of those populations where people were sort of discriminated against because you were Jewish or you were Irish or you were
right,
Italian, like other groups would come in, and I think initially it was to help protect, but of course they
right,
were taking advantage of that situation.
right, right.
And then of course, as you pointed out with prohibition, that's where, I mean, that was just kerosene to
Yes.
sort of
A
a
hundred, a
flame.
100%. And I have had a very funny experience, which goes along with what we were talking about. And that is, I had read in one of the books that I was doing research on that if you sort of ask people whose families were immigrants during that period, if they had any members of the family that were in the mobs, most often you will find, or often you will find that there were. So when I've given a few talks, because the book just came out in November, and I always ask, and mostly I don't get responses. People don't raise their hands or say yes. But afterward, they come up to me and they say, well, the truth is, my father was a chauffeur for the mafia. Another one said, my father was a driver in Prohibition, was bringing the alcohol, and someone got arrested. It was in jail. And that changed our whole life. And one of my cousins said to me, she knew exactly who I was talking about with this cousin of our mother's, and she named the person, and it wasn't. So she had a gangster on her father's side of the family as well as on mine. So it was not uncommon. Is really the story.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's still around today. I mean, as much as
Of
we'd like to
course.
believe it doesn't exist, or Rudy Giuliani cleaned up New York City. I mean, it's very, even in my town. There's a reason why there's no chain restaurants. There's they're not. There's no
They're not
Applebee's.
welcome.
you know, there's a reason why those places don't exist.
Yes.
It's
Very.
still got influence.
Yes.
There's still a fair
Oh,
amount of
it
that.
totally does. It totally does. And it's I mean, I'm sure it's true also in other countries. There's, it goes on everywhere. But it did have its roots in prohibition, and it grew in its heyday, and that really became something very not unique to New York, because it was true of Chicago and Detroit and Las Vegas and Los Angeles as well.
Oh
Any
yeah,
big city had it, and New Orleans, So, yeah. But I
yeah,
wrote specifically about this Brooklyn and the Jewish and the Italian gangs. So,
yeah. A
yeah,
lot of and then I think there was, you mentioned The Godfather before,
right.
and of course there's been so many movies about sort of the Italian mafia, but the one movie I do remember about the Jewish mafia, I mean, I guess you could put Bugsy in there, which I don't know. That
Sure. Yes,
was
he
a
was.
he was Carrie. You know, I think it was who was it? Warren Beatty played Bugsy Siegel in
Yes,
that movie.
Bugsy
But
Siegel.
there was a great movie with Robert De Niro and James Woods called I think it was called
Yes,
Once Upon a Time in
Once
America.
Upon a Time in America. When I was doing research for this book, I watched the uncut version
Yeah,
of that movie, which was 4 hours long
it's a
and
long
was
movie. It's a long movie.
remarkable. But then apparently they cut it because
Mm,
4 hours was not going to go, and it became a shambles because they left so much out. But I
yeah,
watched the 4 hours, and it was amazing. It
yeah.
was just a brilliant movie,
And
and that one was about the Jewish gangs, right?
yeah, and it was
Yeah,
I never heard of that movie. My neighbor said, "Hey, you got to watch this movie." He had a copy of
yeah.
it, and he
Did you
lent it
watch the
to me.
4 hours?
I did, yeah, I did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I did. Yeah, it
I
was
loved it.
a great film. I mean, slow at parts, but it's
Right.
certainly a.
Yeah.
If I remember, it's somebody in an opium den. If I remember correctly,
Well,
there was.
because that started that it was the end of it, and then he was sort of remembering everything that had happened. That
Right.
was Robert De Niro.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I thought it was great. I loved it. So
Yeah.
yeah,
He's probably played more mobsters than any other actor. Because starting with Godfather 2, and then
yes,
of
yes,
course,
yeah, yeah,
Goodfellas and Casino, and
yeah.
yeah,
Yes, he's a great actor. He really is. But he's been in
yeah,
a lot of comedies too, and
he
romances. He
has.
was in one with Sophia, not Sophia. What's her name? She, oh God, she played in Sophie's Choice. What's the brilliant actress that everybody loves? Well, I can't remember her name right now.
That's okay. This isn't. We're not doing trivia yet. I'll save that for
No,
later
okay,
in our conversation.
yeah,
um, so I always like to get to know my guests a little bit more by asking some questions around pop culture. So I'm curious, when you were younger, like what were some of the authors you liked to read when you
Oh,
were
when I was a kid,
younger? Yeah, yeah,
uh-huh. So I read a lot of the classics because I think that I mean I read the Nancy Drews and those kinds of books, but the book I read over and over again was Little Women. I loved that book, and Jo was my hero. She, the writer. Um, I
yeah.
I just absolutely adored that book, and I'm trying to remember some of the. I remember reading a series about World War II, which was very exciting and scary because it had happened in near history, which I think is different than when you're reading something that happened in the Civil War or something that was so
Sure.
far away. Um, I like to read about women or girl heroines
Hmm.
because so I remember reading books about Florence Nightingale. I loved that one, of course, because of my name, and Clara Barton. Nurses because they were starting something new. I really, yeah, and girl reporters. But I read a lot of classics, and my mother would give me every book that she had. Some of them I remember one of my aunts saying, I read Gone with the Wind when I was probably, I don't know, 9. And my aunt said, "How can you let her read that?" Well, I mean, she said, "Well, the things that she doesn't understand, she won't understand." But she just figured if I could read it, it was fine. And so, and I read all the time. That was something that I mean, we didn't have television, and it was we had radio, of course. We listened to the radio a lot, but I didn't have television till I was in junior high school. But those early years, we didn't have it.
Yeah,
So
I like to, I would have loved to have, experienced that time period where, people were just sitting around the radio and
mhm.
listening to stories. And I think a lot of, podcasting to me,
Podcasts,
it's,
absolutely
I mean, it's a throwback really to the days when we told, audio stories over the radio. I
right. I think that when I was commuting to work, I listened I didn't read so much because I didn't have very much time, but the half hour or 45-minute commute, I would listen to novels, or not nonfiction books. And that's how I read. And that was like the radio. It was great.
Yeah.
And so both of my books are in audio because a lot of people now, that's the way they like to quote unquote read.
Yeah, I know it's true. It's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about movies? Do you have any favorite movies? Any sort of movies speak to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, the movies that we were talking about, I loved them. I loved, just recently, last year it was Christmas, and that's why I thought about it. We watched The Fabelmans. We went to the theater and we watched The Fabelmans, and I loved that. That was a family story, and I really really enjoyed that. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing the Leonard Bernstein.
Oh yeah, with Bradley Cooper, right?
With Bradley Cooper, I very much want to see that. He was a great hero in our family because he was such a brilliant conductor and musician. And in fact, my nephew knew him because he played in Tanglewood. He was a student violinist and under Bernstein.
Oh wow.
So yeah. What other movies? I loved Little Women. I loved love stories of all sorts. I was very romantic, just like you would expect. Can't even remember all the names of them, but I loved, the heroic men. And we went to the movies almost every Saturday, and there would be a double feature in those days. You would go, you'd see two movies. Could you imagine sitting through two movies now? Plus we used to call them serials in the middle.
Serials,
yeah, right. So, yeah, that was a lot of fun. And I also, grew up going to Broadway shows and, musicals when I was a kid. And then when I was in college, of course, I, went to all the drama. I remember sitting through Long Day's Journey into Night, which was a very long play.
Yeah.
But
I'm curious as we sort of wrap up here, Florence, if you could go back in time and whisper some words of advice into your younger, your younger self's ear, what would you tell the younger Florence?
Yeah. Well, I'm very, I almost gave up my dream. And I'm very glad that I didn't, but I would probably say to that younger writer, you can do it. Don't despair because you didn't have success right away, but keep going. Because there was a period where I sort of dropped it, and then I picked it up again, and I started taking classes and everything, and writing, and I did that because I suddenly had the thought that, I could go through my whole life and be very happy as a social worker and a mother of 3 children, and still I would have not achieved my biggest dream. And that made me very sad, the thought of that. So that was when I picked up my writing again really seriously. So I would tell my younger self, don't give it up.
Yeah.
So
how close were you
to old?
How close were you to giving it up?
Well, when I went back to social work school, I had these 3 young kids, and I was in social work school, and I really couldn't write much. So, I thought to myself, well, I'm never going to make it as a writer. And so, I think it depends on what you define as make it. I know that, or I don't think I'll be a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list, but I feel I'm successful if people read the book, like it, tell their friends about it, they like it, and they tell other people. And that has happened to me. So I have to say that I feel successful in that sense and feel good about my books and the fact that I achieved it later in my life is okay.
And to some extent, I think things happen when they're meant to happen.
Yeah, true. Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it's quote to quote your terms later in life. I think that's when it was supposed to happen for you. Then
I like that.
It's
I like that, Michael.
Well, there you go. Maybe I should be a therapist someday. That was actually that was career 1.0. That was what I was going to do. And then I got sidetracked.
Well, there you go. But you did write. I mean, you published a mystery. I understand. I haven't read it yet.
No,
right.
it's I will not plug my book on your episode. I will,
well, that's another one of the kinds of books I like to read. So maybe I'll write a mystery also.
Yeah, there you go. It is quirky. It is a quirky one, so that's for sure.
That's good. Quirky is good.
Florence, where can people learn more about you? I imagine somebody sitting at home saying, "Hey, I wonder if she's on. She has a website, or if she's on social media."
I have a website, FlorenceReissKraut.com. It has lots of. It has some short stories. It has some chapters of the first book that didn't get into the first book but are on my website. It has blogs and travelogues because we've traveled a lot, and I like to write about travel. And so that's my website. And of course, it has both books and ways to get in touch with me if you want to have a book club. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. Florence Reiss Kraut, author, is my author page, and so you can see all about me there, and all of my events. I put them on Facebook and so on. And what else? I'm on all the social media platforms, but I guess I use probably Instagram and Facebook the most.
All right. I'll be sure to put all of those links in our show notes. So all people have to do is just tap on it and not have to worry about writing everything down that you just said. So
yes, that's right.
We'll make it easy to find you, and we'll put in links to buy the book as well. So Florence, thank you so much for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
I am delighted to have been here. It's been fun to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.